What's up, everybody? Welcome back to part 3 of my review of the state's response opposing a motion for post-conviction relief for Steven Avery. This is the state's latest response to Kathleen Zellner's newest filing on behalf of Steven Avery in an attempt to get him an evidentiary hearing. We're going to pick up where we left off on page 15 of this response, and it is B, opportunity. The second prong of the legitimate tendency test asks whether the alleged third-party perpetrator could have committed the crime in question. Evaluation of this prong is guided by the defense theory of the third party's involvement in the crime. Sometimes opportunity can be established by simply showing the third party was at the crime scene, when as here the theory of how the third party committed the crime requires the person to have carried out a series of complicated and difficult tasks. Whoever did this carried out a series of complicated and difficult tasks is not enough to show the third party's mere presence at the scene had an unaccounted for period of time. In this situation, to meet the opportunity prong, the defendant has to offer evidence that the alleged third-party perpetrator had the skills, contacts, tools, time, and or other means necessary to have committed the crime and staged the scene in the manner the defendant alleges. In other words, evidence that the third party had the realistic ability to engineer such a scenario. And it's been explained how whoever did it had the opportunity and means to do what was done. Holding that a third party's had possible access to hair and blood samples from the victim was mere conjecture insufficient to establish opportunity to frame the defendant. Avery's submissions do not meet this threshold. Avery fails to acknowledge that his defense theory has changed drastically from the time of the trial. Then, his contention was that he was framed by law enforcement who had plenty of time, knowledge, and access to evidence to plausibly doctor the crime scene. Now he claims, because of new information and new evidence that has come out, now he claims his nephew, Bobby Dassey, framed him and did so in a very short time period. That means to sufficiently plead his motion, he had to prove more than just a showing that Bobby physically had access to the evidence because he was on the property. He had to show that Bobby had the actual ability to both commit the murder and then complete each step of the framing process, and to do so before November 5th. And Avery has not provided facts that would establish at least 4 key components necessary to sufficiently plead that Bobby had the opportunity to kill the victim and plant all the evidence against his uncle: the why, the when, the where, and the how. Assuming, for the sake of argument, that Avery had pled facts that would establish Bobby's motive to kill in the first place, and as explained above, he has not. Avery has not offered anything that would suggest why Bobby would want to frame Avery, especially given the grave risks and extreme difficulty of doing so. Well, why would he frame his uncle? So that he allegedly wouldn't go to jail for murder himself. That's why he would allegedly do that. Seems like a good reason. Anyone who murders someone typically wants to escape detection, but that does not explain why Bobby would frame Avery for it, especially when doing so would ensure that law enforcement would be taking a close and intense look at the entire Avery property and everyone who lived on it. He offers no reason why Bobby would want to send him to prison. Again, so Bobby himself wouldn't have to go to prison. That's allegedly why he would do that, right? If Bobby Dassey truly wanted to hide the evidence of a crime he committed, there were limitless ways to do so that would not have led law enforcement directly to Dassey's door. For example, Lake Michigan, for example, was a mere few miles from Avery's property. Are they giving different ways that someone could have disposed of this body? Avery's property and the property was surrounded by vast tracts of undeveloped land, nor has Avery explained why someone who wanted to frame him would go to such lengths to hide the evidence. Again, so that they aren't caught. That's a ridiculous thing of why someone would want to frame him. That's such a weird sentence. Surely if Bobby or anyone else wanted to frame Avery, they wouldn't have gone out of their way to make all of the evidence difficult for law enforcement to detect. Maybe they wanted to get away with it, but set it up so that if they did find it, it would all point to Steven Avery. These are easy things to explain why someone would do what they did. It's pretty much common sense to me that would be the reason why they would do it. They would want to make it look like they didn't do it, but if someone did find the evidence, maybe it would point to someone else. It's pretty simple thinking if you ask me. Not that anyone has ever asked me. Surely if Bobby or anyone else wanted to frame Avery, they wouldn't have gone out of their way to make all of the evidence difficult for law enforcement to detect, gather, and connect to Avery. Sure they would. It makes no sense to burn the victim's remains. Sure it does. And personal property in an attempt to conceal them. What a ridiculous thing to say. That makes perfect sense. You're probably thinking if we burn it, there's nothing going to be detectable. Or to drip Avery's blood around the RAV4, but then remove the license plate from an attempt to hide the vehicle by covering it with debris. They covered it with like sticks to debris at a point far away from Avery's trailer. Avery has provided no facts explaining why Bobby Dassey's framing him is plausible when he has given no reason whatsoever that would explain why Bobby would do this. Bobby would do this so that he isn't caught and convicted himself. Allegedly. Avery's argument fails on the when and the how, as well as he's provided nothing that could plausibly establish that Bobby had the knowledge, skills, tools, or time to engineer this elaborate ruse. The mere fact that Bobby was on the Avery property at some time when Avery's hand was bleeding falls short of necessary to establish that Bobby had the opportunity to successfully orchestrate this extremely complicated supposed frame-up. Mere presence at the scene of a shooting was insufficient to show that the defendant had the contacts and resources necessary to have had the opportunity to orchestrate a hit on the victim. The complete absence of the necessary facts to support several crucial elements of how Bobby could have accomplished staging this scene demonstrates that Avery failed to plead sufficient facts to show that Bobby had any opportunity to kill the victim and frame Avery in this manner. Avery has offered no facts at all that would establish how Bobby Dassey, an 18-year-old high school graduate with no criminal record whatsoever, who was working third shift at a furniture factory, managed to steal at some unidentified time prior to October 31st the rifle hanging above Avery's bed. He could have easily walked in at any point in time when Steven Avery wasn't home and took the rifle, which the victim was shot at some other unidentified time before November 5th, managed to replace it with Avery never noticing. Oh look, he's leaving, I'll go put the gun back. Easy. Could have abducted and killed the victim and hidden both her body and her car in some unknown area in the minutes between her arrival on the property and Scott Taddock passing Bobby Dassey on the highway around 3 p.m. on October 31st, 2005. Nor has Avery provided any facts to establish where the killing could have happened in or where Bobby could have hidden the RAV4 and the victim's remains in this short period of time. Had the sufficient sophistication and knowledge necessary for it to occur. To Bobby to collect, transport, and plant Avery's blood from his sink, and as Avery completely overlooked his non-blood touch on the DNA hood latch of the victim's RAV4 and her keys. Well, those keys that showed up like after the 7th or 8th search of Steven Avery's bedroom, or how Bobby acquired the skills to do this successfully. had a convenient stash of unidentified instruments capable of collecting and transporting liquid blood on hand, or what those might have been. Planted the keys to the RAV4 in Avery's trailer unnoticed, and at some unspecific time between November 3rd and November 5th, yet also either managed to move the RAV4 off the 40-acre property without the keys, or drive it away and return on foot from wherever he supposedly took it, and then sneak it into Avery's trailer again to hide the keys at some other unidentified time, once again unnoticed. Oh look, he's going out. There, unnoticed. The fact that they're saying unnoticed like it's some big difficult task is weird. Found and then planted a tiny mangled bullet fragment that Bobby inexplicitly knew had the victim's DNA on it underneath items in Avery's garage, or alternatively how he shot the victim in Avery's garage on October 31st and then at another unidentified time scrubbed the scene with Avery remaining unaware. This despite Avery's indisputably having been working on his Suzuki and other vehicles in and around the garage around this time. Burned the victim's body in some undisclosed location and then moved the remains to Avery's burn pit, again completely undetected, and did it so thoroughly as to include at least a fragment or more of almost every bone below the neck in the entire human skeleton, along with rivets from her jeans, nor has Avery provided any facts showing where and when this occurred. Convinced his younger brother Brendan to go along with this plan and fabricate a confession, a very much fed to him confession, implicating himself and Avery, or why Brendan would do so. He did this to protect himself, allegedly. So easy to explain. The fact that this is so long and really says nothing. It's so easy to explain why Bobby would have done any of this. You could explain why Bobby did any of this in one sentence: to protect himself. Even if one accepts at face value Avery's theory that Bobby was scientifically sophisticated and equipped enough for it to occur to him to do all of the blood evidence gathering and planting, Avery provides nothing that would explain how Bobby could have done so in roughly a half an hour window before the blood would have dried when Avery was at Maynard's on November 3rd, and Avery has not pled even a single fact to establish how or when Bobby could have planted any of the rest of the mountain of forensic evidence against Steven Avery. The victim's remains, the non-blood DNA evidence, and the bullet, and also successfully eliminate any trace of his own involvement or physical presence. In sum, Avery has provided no facts in his motion that would establish why Bobby would want to frame him, or when, where, or how Bobby could have possibly accomplished any of the necessary tasks to make this theory plausible. He has supplied nothing other than a series of constantly shifting affidavits about his and other activities during the relevant time frame, and then backfilled it with speculation with zero factual support. They don't have any factual support in this either, just tossing that out there, about how a small fraction of the evidence against him, the blood and the car only, could have ended up where it was if someone else was the perpetrator, and pretends the rest of the evidence does not exist. Thomas Sawinski's April 10th, 2021 affidavit that is flatly insufficient to provide facts that could show that Bobby had the opportunity to engineer this complicated scheme. Well, I'm going to end part 3 right here, and then we will be back with part C of the state's response opposing a motion for post-conviction relief to Steven Avery. Part C is direct connection. Let me know what you think. Leave some comments below. I hope you're having a good day, and I'll see you again soon.